Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the coldest unsolved cases in human history, literally frozen. We're talking about Ötzi the Iceman, a 5,000-year-old murder victim preserved so perfectly that he looks like he fell asleep yesterday and forgot to set his alarm for the next 50 centuries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The discovery of Ötzi, the Iceman, did not involve a team of elite scientists, a dramatic excavation, or even a guy with a notebook pretending to know what sediment is. No, it began with two hikers in 1991 who were just trying to enjoy the Alps without slipping to their deaths. They looked down and saw what they assumed was an unfortunate tourist who had really misread the weather report. The body was lying face down, one arm stiff, the other twisted under him like he had tried to stop his fall, but remembered too late that human limbs don't actually do that. His skin had the delightful texture of sun-dried leather, and his whole vibe screamed, "I've been dead a long time, please stop poking me." Naturally, hikers called the authorities, because nothing kills the mood of a peaceful alpine walk like realizing you've stumbled onto a crime scene from the Copper Age. The police arrived with enthusiasm usually reserved for parking violations. They took one look at the frozen figure and assumed this was just another mountaineer who ignored every safety sign ever invented. Then came the moment that future historians will never stop laughing about. The police tried to pry his body out of the ice by yanking on his arm. That's right. The oldest preserved corpse in Europe was almost removed with the same technique used to open a stubborn pickle jar. But then someone noticed the shoes. Not boots, not sneakers. Shoes made from animal hide and grass, the kind of footwear you only see in documentaries narrated by people with soothing voices. Then they found the copper axe. Clean, polished, and very much not from the modern hiker section at REI. Copper tools haven't been standard gear since people believed the wheel was a trendy new invention. That's when the penny dropped. This wasn't a recent casualty. This wasn't even a medieval casualty. This was a 5,300-year-old man who had somehow refused to decompose out of sheer spite. Archaeologists were summoned, and they arrived like kids on Christmas morning. Suddenly, the police weren't allowed to touch anything anymore, which was for the best, because the next logical move would have been someone shouting, "Okay, let's just tug harder," and just like that, the Alps delivered the world's oldest cold case, literally frozen, perfectly preserved, and ready for a forensic comeback tour 5 millennia in the making. If Ötzi had died anywhere else, a forest, a field, literally any location with normal weather, we would have nothing, no body, no gear. Maybe a tooth or two if we're lucky, but Ötzi didn't die in a reasonable place. No, he chose a freezing alpine mountaintop, the prehistoric equivalent of hitting save on your entire existence. The glacier that swallowed him acted like a long-term storage unit, the kind you forget to pay for, but somehow never loses your stuff. Thanks to several thousand years of ice, snow, and the universe's worst freezer burn, Ötzi was preserved with more detail than some modern celebrity skincare routines. His skin had turned into a high-quality Copper Age weatherproof hide. His hair survived with the stubborn determination of a man who said, "I paid for this haircut and I'm taking it with me to the afterlife." His fingernails, intestines, and even the contents of his stomach were still intact. That's not preservation. That's a cosmic overachievement. When scientists examined him for the first time, the reaction was basically, "Wow, he looks great." Like, disturbingly great. His tattoos, over 60 of them, still lined his body, mostly along joints and pressure points. Early commentators claimed this meant spiritual significance. Later analysis suggested he probably just had chronic pain and invented acupuncture out of desperation, which honestly tracks. Nothing motivates innovation like bad joints and no ibuprofen. Then there were his clothes. Fashion forward for 3,300 BCE, but also wildly chaotic. A coat made from goat fur, leggings from sheep hide, a hat from brown bear fur, which says a lot about both his confidence and his risk tolerance. His shoes were a masterpiece, grass-woven interiors with deerskin exteriors, basically Crocs for ancient mountain survival. And let's not forget the backpack, a wooden frame with leather straps that suspiciously resembles something you'd buy on Ötzi from a guy named Rune. Everything about him screamed, this man knew how to survive, which makes the fact he got murdered even more embarrassing. You can be outfitted like the Batman of prehistory and still get taken out by one well-placed arrow. What's most impressive is that Ötzi lay there for 5,300 years without anyone disturbing him. No predators, no scavengers, not even a curious goat. Just a man, a glacier, and a murder mystery aging like fine wine no one asked for. If there's one thing Ötzi didn't do, it was travel light. The man hiked like someone who trusted absolutely nothing. Not the weather, not the mountains, not even other humans, which, to be fair, turned out to be a tragically accurate instinct. When researchers catalogued his belongings, the list read like the Copper Age version of a doomsday prepper's backpack. First, the copper axe, and not some primitive chunk of metal. This thing was a status symbol. Pure copper blade, finely polished, mounted on a yew wood handle. Owning this axe 5,300 years ago was the equivalent of driving a brand new Mercedes through a village where everyone else has donkeys. It sent a message. I'm important, and also, don't mess with me. Then there was the bow. Unfortunately, it wasn't finished, which raises questions. Did he break the old one? Was he rushed when fixing it? Did someone interrupt his arts and crafts session with violence? The bow was nearly his height, made of yew wood, the kind of weapon that, once complete, could drop a deer or a rude neighbour. His arrows were a whole saga, some complete, some half-made. One had the wrong fletching angle, proving Ötzi was either in a hurry or had the prehistoric version of ADHD. If you ever feel bad about procrastinating, remember, this man literally died before finishing his to-do list. Next, the knife, a small flint blade with a wooden handle, not fancy, but reliable. And yes, it had someone else's blood on it. Nothing says, I've had a stressful morning, like carrying a knife that's recently been in another person. Researchers identified 4 separate blood types across his gear. So Ötzi wasn't just running from danger. He had participated. He carried a fire-starting kit, like a man who had been betrayed by the weather before. Flint, pyrite, and tinder fungus. Basically, everything necessary to start a fire in any conditions short of a full biblical flood. And can't skip the medicine kit. Bundles of birch polypore fungus, anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, and anti-parasite. This wasn't folklore. This was effective prehistoric pharmacology. The man was treating infections before infection was even a word. Finally, the frame backpack. Reinforced wooden structure, leather straps, sturdy, practical, and 100% Ötzi core. It held everything from tools to food scraps, proving the man believed in being prepared for absolutely anything. Anything except, apparently, an arrow to the back. If there's one thing Ötzi didn't do before dying, it was skip lunch. In fact, the man's final hours look less like a desperate flight for survival, and more like someone panic-eating their way through a crisis. Thanks to the icy miracle of nature's longest-running refrigerator, scientists were able to analyze not just his bones and organs, but the snack choices he made shortly before being murdered. And let me tell you, Ötzi went out with a full stomach. His last meal was a prehistoric charcuterie board, ibex meat, red deer, spelt grains, fat, pollen, and what can only be described as wild herbs someone claimed were healthy. Basically, he ate the Copper Age version of a protein-heavy meal prep box designed by a caveman nutrition influencer. What's fascinating and slightly comedic is that he ate 2 distinct meals before he died, like a man who couldn't decide if he needed fuel for a hike or comfort food for emotional devastation. Meal 1. This earlier meal shows no stress markers, no elevated activity, no panic. He was just vibing, eating ibex meat, enjoying his day, totally unaware that someone would soon turn him into a historical celebrity corpse. Meal 2. This one was different. The ibex meat was consumed under stress. His metabolism was in fight or flight mode. Basically, he inhaled his food like someone who had just been told, "Listen, you might want to eat now. You won't get the chance later." We know this because his stomach still held visible layers of chewed fat and meat, the digestive equivalent of leaving your browser tabs open at the moment of your death. And here's the wildest part. Researchers found fresh pollen from plants blooming in warm valleys, yet he died high in the mountains, meaning sometime that day he had travelled from valley warmth to icy heights in a hurry. You don't climb thousands of feet unless you're incredibly motivated, you're incredibly stupid, or someone is trying to kill you. Given the arrow in his back, we're going with door number 3. The meal also had charcoal traces, which suggests Ötzi cooked something moments before being murdered. Imagine that, standing over a fire, grilling your last bite of ibex, thinking, "Ah yes, nothing like a warm meal before a long climb," while your assassin is somewhere behind a boulder thinking, "Perfect, he's distracted." So yes, Ötzi's Last Supper wasn't ceremonial, spiritual, or poetic. It was stress-eating, and unfortunately, not nearly enough. If Ötzi's final hours were a movie, this is where the soundtrack would shift from peaceful mountain flutes to "Something is very wrong" drums. By the time he started climbing the Alps for the last time, he wasn't just tired or stressed, he was visibly injured. And not, "I stubbed my toe on a rock," injured. More, "I've just had a physical altercation with multiple humans, and none of them sent a follow-up apology." His hands told the story first. Fresh cuts. Several of them. Not old scars or ancient wounds, but brand new slices. The kind you get when someone is trying to hit you, stab you, or politely request your death. His knuckles were swollen, which suggests he wasn't just blocking blows. He was swinging back. Imagine the world's coldest bar fight, except instead of a bar it's a forested valley, and instead of beer you have water from a glacier stream, and the deep, bone-crushing knowledge that bathrooms have not been invented yet. Ötzi's knife added another chapter to the tale. It had traces of blood on it, not his, and the blood belonged to multiple individuals. This means one thing. Ötzi had been dealing with more than one opponent. Whether he fought one after another like a prehistoric action hero or was overwhelmed in a chaotic group skirmish, we'll never know. What we do know is that he did not leave that fight unmarked. His gear was damaged, his body was wearing the aftermath, and his general energy screamed, "I need a nap, a doctor, and maybe divine intervention." What makes the scene even more dramatic is what he did next. Ötzi began repairing his bow, not casually, urgently. Half-assembled arrows, a half-finished bowstring, wooden shafts carved in haste. The man was preparing for another confrontation. You don't sit down after a fight, bleeding and exhausted, and start doing arts and crafts unless you believe violence is coming back for round 2. His movements in the hours after the fight paint a clear picture. He was trying to get away. He climbed upward into dangerous terrain, the kind no sane person chooses, unless they're either extremely confident or extremely hunted. With injured hands and a partially repaired weapon, he pushed toward higher ground, leaving behind the valley where everything had gone wrong. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He was retreating, fast, wounded, and deeply aware that someone wasn't finished with him yet. By the time Ötzi was climbing the final stretch of the Alps, he was essentially a walking crime scene, held together by adrenaline, ibex fat, and the stubborn refusal to die somewhere inconvenient. But fate, or his murderer, had other plans. The defining moment of this entire saga came not from his knife, not from his injuries, and not from the suspiciously unfinished bow he was trying to assemble mid-crisis. It came from an arrow. A single shot. A perfect strike launched by someone who either had remarkable aim or had been practicing on many previous victims. Forensic scans showed the arrow entered his back at an angle only possible if his killer was behind him and slightly above, meaning someone had taken the literal high ground. The arrow tore through muscle, pierced into his left shoulder, and severed an artery. This wasn't an oops, missed the deer moment. This was intentional, precise, and as subtle as a prehistoric text message saying, "We are done here." Once that arrow hit, Ötzi wouldn't have lasted long. Minutes at best. The force of the shot was strong enough to bury the flint arrowhead so deeply that even modern scanners had to work to find it. The shaft had broken off, likely in the chaos as he fell, leaving the tip lodged securely in his body for 5,300 years. What's almost tragic is that Ötzi probably never even saw it coming. He was moving uphill, exhausted from earlier conflict, clutching gear that was only partially functional, and likely trying to put distance between himself and the people who were very clearly trying to make him one with the glacier. The killer waited until exhaustion and altitude had done their job, then delivered a clean, lethal blow from behind, the Copper Age version of a professional hit. The moment the arrow struck, Ötzi would have lost strength instantly. His blood pressure dropped, his breath faltered, and whatever fight he had left evaporated. He collapsed on the stone and ice, face first, without even having time to turn around. The scene is haunting. A man frozen in the exact posture of his death, arms extended, body limp, knife still strapped to him, tools scattered in the snow he never meant to fall on. There were no final words, no dramatic last stand, no heroic retaliation, just a silent, sudden ending, the kind of death only a skilled assassin or extremely committed enemy could deliver. Ötzi wasn't just attacked, he was executed. Ötzi's last moments were not glamorous. There was no dramatic speech, no heroic final stand, no ancient equivalent of, "Tell my family I love them." Instead, his final act on Earth was collapsing face first onto a slab of ice with the exhausted grace of someone who'd simply had enough of the day's nonsense. After the arrow struck, he staggered a little farther uphill, because apparently he believed climbing higher would help, as if altitude had ever solved anyone's problems. The Alps were not on his side. The landscape was steep, the air thin, and Ötzi's blood was rapidly leaving the building like an unimpressed theatre audience. His heart and lungs were failing, and any attempt to fight back, scream, or sprint was impossible. Physiologically speaking, he was out of moves. He fell forward, arms splayed, like a man who had been denied even the dignity of choosing a comfortable position to die in. Modern archaeologists found him in the exact posture he collapsed in. Not rearranged, not disturbed, just lying there with the defeated stillness of a person who thought, "You know what? I'm not getting up from this." One could argue the glacier was both cruel and kind. Cruel because it offered him nowhere to hide, no shelter, not even a soft patch of snow to cushion his fall. Kind because, once he was down, it embraced him with millennia of ice and said, "Don't worry, buddy. I'll handle the preservation." The killer didn't come back to check the body, loot the gear, or confirm the job. They simply left. Whoever shot him must have known the wound was fatal. Or maybe they had other problems to deal with, like running before Ötzi's friends arrived, or pretending they hadn't just committed the oldest documented homicide in human history. And so, the Alps kept him. Wind, ice, snow, storms, none of it moved him. His body slowly froze, then became part of the glacier itself, preserved better than any pharaoh wrapped in gold. No animals got to him. No scavengers clawed at him. Even nature seemed to say, "We're saving this one. He looks important." Little did anyone know, 5,000 years later, Ötzi would be found exactly as he fell, like a prehistoric crime scene photo waiting for someone to finally show up and file the report. His final collapse wasn't just a tragic moment, it became the opening scene of the world's oldest cold case. If Ötzi himself couldn't tell us who killed him, his blood certainly tried. Unfortunately, blood is terrible at keeping secrets when you have modern forensic technology, and Ötzi's turned out to be the biological equivalent of a messy group chat. When scientists analysed the microscopic traces left on his tools and clothing, they weren't expecting anything dramatic. Maybe some deer residue, maybe something he cooked earlier that day. What they found instead was straight out of a prehistoric crime drama. 4 different human blood types. This means that in the hours before his death, Ötzi had interacted with, or stabbed, at least 4 other people. And given that only one of them was him, things start looking suspiciously like the Copper Age was less peaceful Neolithic farming community and more every man for himself, please bring your own weapons. His flint knife held the most concerning evidence, someone else's blood smeared along the blade, and not dried old flecks from weeks ago, fresh patterns consistent with recent contact. His arrows had similar traces, suggesting they had been shot, retrieved, and possibly reused. Archaeologists politely call this evidence of conflict. A less academic term would be, this man was busy. The blood found on his gear paints a timeline. First, there was the close quarters skirmish, the one that left Ötzi with cut hands, bruises, and the kind of emotional exhaustion only achievable when fighting multiple people without proper hydration. Then there was the retreat, the frantic attempt to escape up the mountain, and the desperate scramble to repair his weapons. And finally, the fatal arrow fired by a pursuer who apparently had the accuracy of an Olympic archer and the ethics of a soap opera villain. But the most haunting detail comes from the shield-like structure of the blood itself. The splatter on his coat and tools suggests Ötzi might have helped someone right before running. Some researchers believe he attempted to carry or aid a wounded companion. If true, that means his final hours weren't just violent. They were tragic, heroic, and deeply unlucky. Imagine trying to save someone, only to be chased up a mountain and shot for your trouble. Prehistoric friendship was a dangerous game. In the end, the blood patterns turned Ötzi from frozen hiker into last survivor of a very bad afternoon. His tools weren't just supplies, they were evidence. 4 blood types, 1 murder victim, and a mystery written in red, preserved in ice. If there is one detail in this entire murder case that keeps archaeologists up at night, it's the copper axe. Not the arrow in his back. Not the 4 different people's blood on his gear. Not the fact that his final moments looked like an ancient episode of Man versus Everything. No, it's that nobody stole the axe. This was not some ordinary tool. A copper axe in 3300 BCE was a luxury item. Not nice outfit luxury, more like you are officially the coolest guy in a 50-mile radius. Copper was rare, hard to extract, and even harder to work. Owning a polished copper blade meant status, authority, and probably a little prehistoric swagger. So why was it still on Ötzi's body? If this had been a robbery, the killer would have taken the axe immediately. If it had been an opportunistic attack, the weapon would have vanished long before the ice ever touched him. Even if the killer didn't personally want it, they could have traded it for food, clothes, or a slightly less miserable life expectancy. But instead, it was left behind, neatly, deliberately, untouched. Almost like the murderer wanted the world to know. This wasn't about the stuff. This was about him. This single detail transforms the crime from a random act of violence into something much pettier and far more human, a personal grudge. Someone wanted Ötzi dead, yes, but they didn't want to benefit from it. They weren't trying to rob him or humiliate him. They just wanted him gone permanently. One theory suggests the killer may have been part of Ötzi's own group. Someone who would have recognized the axe instantly and understood its value, yet still left it. Perhaps they didn't take it because everyone in the tribe would have recognized it. Imagine showing up to camp with your murdered friend's prized copper axe. Oh, hey guys, don't mind this, I found it. Not a great alibi. Another theory, even colder, is that the killer left the axe as a message. Something symbolic, like saying, I didn't kill you for your belongings, I killed you because I had a problem with you. And if that isn't the most human, petty, passive-aggressive motive imaginable, I don't know what is. The copper axe lying untouched beside the body doesn't solve the case. But it does tell us one thing clearly. Whoever killed Ötzi didn't want his riches. They wanted his silence. If there is one theme that repeats through human history like a broken drum, it's betrayal. Romans betrayed each other. Medieval kings betrayed each other. Your co-worker probably betrayed you by taking credit for that spreadsheet. But Ötzi? He may have been the first recorded victim of the classic smile at you over lunch, stab you in the back later routine. Literally, science shows that shortly before he died, Ötzi shared a meal with someone. The pollen in his stomach, the meat he ate, even the way the food was cooked all point to a social moment, a fire, companionship. Not the vibe of a man hiding alone in the bushes like a terrified prehistoric raccoon. He wasn't eating in secret. He wasn't starving. He ate a full, warm meal, with help. Whoever prepared or shared that food with him was close, trusted, familiar, possibly even bonded with him through the shared trauma of ancient life, where everything, weather, wildlife, other humans, could kill you with impressive enthusiasm. And yet, hours later, someone shot him in the back. We're not talking about an arrow fired by a stranger stumbling across him in the mountains. We're talking about a shot that required timing, tracking, and intimate knowledge of where Ötzi would be. The killer didn't ambush him randomly. They followed him, waited, watched. They knew he'd climb. They knew he'd flee upward. They knew he'd be exhausted from earlier conflict. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a passing enemy. It comes from someone who knows your habits, someone who knows your footsteps, someone who knows you trust them enough to sit down and eat a meal without checking behind you every 3 seconds. Betrayal in the Copper Age wasn't subtle. There were no passive-aggressive texts or vague social media posts. There were only 2 options. Discuss your feelings like a civilized human, or shoot your problems in the back with a flint-tipped arrow. And it's clear which option Ötzi's companion chose. Imagine the scene. 2 men sitting by the fire, eating calmly, maybe even joking about how exhausting survival is. Then something changes. A disagreement, a rivalry, a threat, or a decision that someone wasn't willing to let go. Hours later, that same man pulled back a bowstring and aimed steadily at Ötzi's spine. When the arrow flew, it carried not just flint, but intention. So when people say, the Alps killed him, they're wrong. It wasn't the mountain. It was someone he trusted. Ötzi's killer vanished into history with the confidence of someone absolutely certain no one would ever investigate a homicide on top of a glacier. And honestly, that was a pretty safe assumption for roughly 5,000 years. There were no witnesses, no DNA databases, no police sketches, no irritated detectives sipping coffee and saying, "Something doesn't add up here, Johnson." There was only silence, snow, and a cooling body lying face down in the world's most remote crime scene. After the arrow struck, the murderer didn't bother to confirm the kill or take a trophy. No dramatic villain speech, no looting, not even a polite toe poke to check if Ötzi was still breathing. They simply walked away, presumably with the calm satisfaction of someone saying, "Great, that problem is handled," and immediately failing to consider that glaciers are extremely judgmental and excellent at long-term storage. What happened next is the part that frustrates every archaeologist. The aftermath we'll never see. Did the killer return to his group and pretend nothing happened? Did he explain away the arrow he just used? Did he say Ötzi wandered off like a prehistoric toddler at a marketplace? Did the group even care? Humans love drama, but prehistoric humans also loved minding their own business. We'll never know which category this particular tribe fell into. And what about the people whose blood ended up on Ötzi's gear? Did they survive their injuries? Did they limp home and spin an entirely different version of events, painting themselves as the hero and Ötzi as the problem? If you've ever heard 2 people describe the same argument, you already know those stories would not have matched. We also can't see how the tribe reacted when Ötzi didn't return. Was he missed? Was he important? Was he the local troublemaker people tolerated out of obligation? Maybe they had a brief moment of concern before shrugging, saying, "Well, that's the mountains for you." Or maybe his absence sparked conflict, suspicion, or a quiet panic that their own group had turned on itself. The truth is, after Ötzi collapsed, the world around him kept turning. His people lived, argued, hunted, slept, and aged without him. His killer continued existing, carrying the secret of a perfect murder, a secret they thought would dissolve into snow and wind, not parade itself across every museum documentary ever made. The aftermath is forever missing. But the silence that followed his death? That lasted 5,000 years. If Ötzi could see the number of scientists who have examined him over the past 3 decades, he would probably file a harassment complaint. The man has been poked, scanned, sliced, swabbed, X-rayed, DNA tested, and analysed from every angle except his Thoughts and Feelings tab, because unfortunately, that's the only category the glacier didn't preserve. Once he was hauled out of the ice, modern forensic science descended on him like kids attacking a piñata. Except instead of candy, they got data, endless, glorious data. His teeth gave clues about his childhood diet. His bones revealed injuries from his final days. His fingernails told the story of stress cycles leading up to the murder. Even his hair held chemical signatures that tracked everywhere he had been in the weeks before he died. Which is impressive, considering most living people don't remember what they did last Tuesday. His tattoos, more than 60 of them, were a highlight. Not the artistic kind you get from a tattoo parlour with a playlist. These were simple lines and crosses, strategically placed along joints and muscle groups. Researchers once assumed they were spiritual symbols. But further analysis suggests something much less mystical. He was trying to treat chronic pain, essentially giving himself prehistoric acupuncture. So the oldest tattooed man on Earth wasn't a ritual leader or an artist. He was just someone with terrible back pain and no access to ibuprofen. Then came the ultimate forensic flex, CT scans. Ötzi has been scanned more than the average airport traveller. Doctors reconstructed his arteries, blood vessels, internal organs, even his facial structure. All from imagery so detailed you could practically diagnose his stress levels. They discovered heart disease, arthritis, dental problems and parasites. Basically a full medical report that screams, life in 3300 BCE was rough. His stomach contents were another investigative goldmine. With high-resolution imaging, researchers identified every component of his last meal, down to the exact cut of ibex meat and the degree of fat marbling. It's the kind of analysis no modern person wants applied to their midnight fridge raids. But the biggest find? A tiny, nearly invisible tear in one of his arteries, proof of the fatal arrow wound. No dramatics, no ambiguity. Just cold, clinical truth served with prehistoric flair. In the end, Ötzi unwittingly became the star of the most thorough forensic examination in human history. CSI teams dream of cases this clear. Doctors dream of patients this well preserved. Ötzi. He probably just wanted to be left alone. After 3 decades of research, countless publications, and more scientific debates than any frozen corpse should ever inspire, one thing remains painfully clear. Nobody can agree on why Ötzi died. Sure, we know how. The arrow to the back was not subtle, but the why has launched more theories than a conspiracy forum on a slow Tuesday. One theory suggests tribal conflict. Maybe Ötzi stumbled into a feud between neighbouring groups. Maybe someone from another village didn't appreciate his copper axe flex. Or maybe he insulted the wrong person's goats, because in 3300 BCE, livestock drama was basically international politics. Under this theory, Ötzi was collateral damage in a conflict far bigger than himself. Another popular explanation is the territorial dispute. Humans have always been weirdly attached to land, even land that is cold, rocky, and generally hostile to life. It's possible that Ötzi wandered into someone else's hunting zone, someone who responded with the prehistoric equivalent of, "Get off my lawn," followed immediately by, "Here's an arrow in your lung for emphasis." Then there's the leadership theory, which is very flattering to Ötzi. Some researchers think he may have been a leader, maybe even a chief. His valuable belongings, especially the copper axe, support the idea. If so, his death could have been a political assassination. Prehistoric politics were likely as chaotic as modern politics, except with fewer speeches and more stabbing. A more dramatic theory is revenge. Remember those 4 different blood types on his gear? That suggests Ötzi had a very hands-on day before his death. Perhaps he injured someone earlier, or killed someone during a fight, and their comrades pursued him into the mountains. If that's true, Ötzi didn't just die. He lost a rematch he didn't even want. And then there's my personal favourite, the personal drama theory. Humans are messy creatures. Always have been. Always will be. Maybe this wasn't about land or politics or tribes. Maybe it was something absurdly personal. A stolen tool. A broken promise. A romantic rivalry. The Copper Age version of, you said you'd help build a fence and then you didn't. Under this theory, Ötzi's murder wasn't historical. It was petty. But here's the truth. All these theories keep circulating because humans desperately want motives to make sense. We want clean narratives. We want answers. But prehistoric life wasn't organized enough for tidy explanations. In the end, the theories won't die because they're all possible. But unfortunately, Ötzi didn't get the same privilege. 5,000 years is a long time to stay relevant. Most people can barely stay relevant for 5 months, but Ötzi? He's aging like a fine archaeological wine, still revealing secrets, still inspiring documentaries, still accidentally teaching us about the human condition. His death matters not because he was royalty, or a celebrity, or a man of great political influence. It matters because he was painfully, wonderfully ordinary, and his death preserved a snapshot of prehistoric life that textbooks can't fake. Before Ötzi, most of what we knew about the European Copper Age was guesswork based on pottery shards, stone tools, and the occasional burial site that looked more like a decorative pile of bones than anything with context. But Ötzi changed the game. He wasn't just a skeleton. He was a whole human. Clothes, tools, stomach contents, tattoos, wounds, drama. He was the full package the Copper Age influencer we never asked for. His death also forced researchers to rethink assumptions about early societies. For decades, historians painted prehistoric Europe as this peaceful, cozy era where everyone held hands, shared berries, and sang songs about communal harmony. Then Ötzi popped out of the ice, tattooed, armed, injured, and murdered. And historians collectively said, so humans have always been like this. He showed the brutality and complexity of early life. People fought, people hunted, people held grudges, and people performed medical treatments sophisticated enough to make modern wellness influencers jealous. His tattoos proved early humans understood chronic pain. His gear proved they understood craftsmanship. His clothing proved they understood insulation better than some modern outdoor brands. Even his final moments matter. The arrow still embedded in him revealed early battlefield tactics. Ambush from behind, shoot for the arteries, don't stick around. A crime as old as humanity itself, preserved in the ice with forensic perfection. And the global fascination with his story tells us something important. People crave a personal connection to the past. We don't just want dates and timelines. We want a face, a life, a mystery. Ötzi provides all three. He matters because he collapsed on a glacier at the exact angle that allowed science to piece together his last day like a Copper Age puzzle. He matters because his story is both tragic and relatable, the tale of a man trying to survive a world that wasn't built to be kind. And ultimately, he matters because his death reminds us that history is not distant, it's human, messy, violent, emotional, and apparently excellent at preservation. If a detective from the modern world were transported back to 3300 BCE, they'd probably last 15 minutes before quitting no fingerprints, no witnesses, no security cameras, no forensics labs. And yet, somehow, the universe decided to preserve Ötzi's crime scene so perfectly that thousands of years later, modern science managed to do what no Copper Age detective ever could: solve the world's oldest cold case. Quite literally, a cold case, refrigerated by nature itself. The irony is delicious. Ötzi's killer probably walked away from the scene convinced they had committed the perfect murder. A remote mountaintop, a dying man. No one around. The Alps make an excellent accomplice. A silent, icy partner who tells no tales. Except the glacier wasn't loyal. It kept every detail. It filed every piece of evidence. It protected the body, the clothes, the tools, the wounds, the stomach contents, And yes, even the murder weapon still embedded in his shoulder. The glacier was the best forensic archivist in history. It just took 5 millennia to open the file. And what does the file say? It tells the story of a man chased up a mountain, wounded, exhausted, then struck down by a well-aimed arrow. It reveals friends, enemies, or frenemies involved in a violent confrontation before the final blow. It shows the desperate repairs to his weapons, the panic meal, the retreat to higher ground. It shows betrayal, fear, survival instinct, and finally, collapse. Modern forensics closed the case in a way Copper Age people never could. CT scans revealed the torn artery. Blood analysis revealed multiple attackers. Tattoo mapping revealed chronic pain. DNA sequencing revealed his ancestry. Pollen analysis revealed the route he took. Even the microscopic abrasions on his arrows revealed how he used them in the final struggle. This level of detail is why Ötzi's murder is not just a story, it's a legacy. He didn't choose to become the most scientifically examined man in history. He didn't choose to have his last moments replayed in every documentary ever made. He didn't choose fame. He just had the misfortune to die in an exceptionally well-preserving freezer. And yet, his story endures because it's not about kings or empires. It's about a human being, flawed, injured, running, fighting, eating, surviving, until he didn't. The case is closed, the mystery solved, the killer gone forever. But Ötzi, he remains, a frozen witness, telling his story long after everyone involved turned to dust. The oldest murder in history didn't stay buried. The ice made sure of that. At the heart of ancient Rome, long before the sense of modern cafes and street vendors filled our cities, there stood a place every Roman, rich or poor, knew intimately. The Thermopolium picture. A narrow street where sunlight bounces off clay tiles, where wagons rumble slowly over uneven stones, and where every corner hums with chatter about gladiators, taxes, and whatever scandal the emperor has created this week. Now picture, tucked between a baker's shop and a linen stall, a lively open-air tavern with its marble counter jutting out toward the street, like an invitation. This is the Roman equivalent of a fast food stand, and at almost any hour of day, it is crowded. The counter itself is the heart of the experience. Built from stone or brick and polished smooth by generations of forearms leaning over it, it's lined with deep terracotta jars, dolia, resting in circular holes. Each jar holds something warm, fragrant, and ready to eat. Lentil stew simmering in a thick, earthy broth, olives swimming in brine, honeyed nuts, spiced chickpeas, or even leftover cuts of pork soaking in garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce Romans loved far more than we ever could. Steam rises from the warmer jars, carrying hints of herbs like lovage, fennel, and thyme. Before the lunch crowds arrive, the owner wipes down the counter, stirs the pots, and checks the coals beneath the jars to keep everything at just the right heat. Behind him, a small kitchen rattles with activity, wood crackling, ladles tapping against clay, and a young helper trying not to burn himself while fishing out stew with a long-handled spoon. By late morning, the first customers appear, labourers with dust on their tunics, fishermen coming in from the river, a tired-looking scribe escaping his cramped office for a moment of warmth and gossip. They step up, balancing clay bowls in one hand and coins in the other. There are no chairs, no private tables, no polished settings, just the counter, the street, and the constant flow of life surrounding them. They eat standing, leaning slightly forward to avoid dripping stew on their sandals, half listening to the conversations around them. And this is where the magic begins, because a Thermopolium was more than a place to eat. It was where everyday Romans came to refill their stomachs and their spirits, catching up on news, scandals, and the pulse of the city itself. A Thermopolium did not offer a grand feast, but what it lacked in elegance, it made up for in warmth, familiarity, and the irresistible comfort of simple food. The menu changed from tavern to tavern, but certain staples appeared everywhere. humble dishes that fueled Rome's labourers, sailors, and market vendors from sunrise to dusk. The moment you stepped up to the counter, you could smell the day's offerings before you ever saw them. First, there was pulse, the thick wheat porridge that had sustained Romans for centuries. Sometimes it was plain and practical, little more than grain and water. Other times it was enriched with herbs or cooked with bits of vegetables, forming a soft, hearty base that stuck to the ribs. Next to it simmered lentil stew, dark and earthy, thickened by hours of slow cooking. The lentils softened until they nearly dissolved, creating a creamy texture flavoured with garlic, olive oil, and crushed coriander seeds. This was one of the cheapest meals available, perfect for men who needed energy more than refinement. Beside the stews sat bowls piled high with olives, their skins glossy from the brine. Black, green, wrinkled or smooth, each type carried a slightly different taste, and patrons often took a handful to snack on as they walked. If a tavern was lucky enough to be close to the coast, you might also find pickled fish, salted anchovies, or scraps of tuna preserved in oil. But no Roman meal felt complete without bread. Not the soft, airy loaves we know today, but dense rounds of wheat or barley, often stamped with a bakery mark. Customers tore off chunks to scoop stew, soak up sauces, or simply chew between sips of cheap wine watered down just enough to stretch the tavern's supplies. And then, of course, came garum, Rome's favourite flavour enhancer. Sharp, salty, and utterly unmistakable, it was drizzled over nearly everything. A bowl of lentils became richer. A slice of bread gained depth. Even olives found new life when dipped lightly into the fermented sauce. To the Romans, garum was not strange. It was essential, the taste of home, the taste of the empire itself. As customers ate, they wiped their bowls clean, returned them to the counter, and, if coins allowed, ordered seconds for many. This simple, fragrant menu was not a treat, but a daily routine, the fuel that kept the entire city moving hour after hour. If there was one thing that defined street food in ancient Rome, it was movement. Nothing stood still for long. Not the crowds, not the gossip, not even the customers themselves. Eating at a thermopolium was never a leisurely event. There were no cushioned seats, no shade-lined terraces, no servers gracefully weaving between tables. Instead, Romans ate standing up, balancing clay bowls in their palms, while shifting their weight to avoid being bumped by those rushing past. The rhythm of the street didn't stop just because a man wanted lunch, so patrons learned to adapt, leaning against walls, fountain edges, or even each other as they spooned stew into their mouths. The bowls were rounded and small enough to cradle easily, yet deep enough to hold a hearty portion of lentils, chickpeas, or barley porridge. Bread was torn one-handed, used as both utensil and sponge, and wine, often watered down, was gulped from simple ceramic cups. A quick meal meant efficiency, and the average Roman had perfected the skill. The standing habit was not only practical, but social. Hunger brought people together, and the thermopolium acted as a sort of informal neighbourhood forum. One man might be finishing a bowl while another squeezed in beside him, already launching into a complaint about taxes or the heat. Someone else might be recounting the results of last night's chariot race. A fisherman brushing salt from his tunic might jokingly argue with a baker about whose work was tougher. Even strangers briefly became companions, connected by the shared moment of pausing in a city that rarely paused for anything. This style of eating reinforced a deep Roman preference. Meals were for necessity, not luxury, unless you were wealthy. While the aristocrats reclined on couches at private banquets, the working classes considered a filling bowl eaten upright to be perfectly normal. For them, eating standing wasn't a sign of hardship, but simply a rhythm of life. It allowed them to finish lunch in minutes before returning to their trade, chores, or daily responsibilities. What made the scene even more vivid was the constant backdrop of sound. Vendors shouting, children running, pots clattering, donkeys braying, and fountains splashing. All of it mingled with the aroma of warm stew and fresh bread. And amidst this daily commotion, the simple act of eating while standing became a uniquely Roman ritual. fast, functional, and full of human connection. If the thermopolium fed the stomach, it also fed something even more essential to Roman life: conversation. These crowded street taverns were the beating heart of everyday gossip. News did not spread through tidy announcements or written bulletins. It passed from mouth to mouth, ladle to bowl, customer to customer. Anyone who stepped up for a quick meal became part of this living network of whispers, jokes, rumours, and bold opinions about the events shaping the city. The favourite topic: gladiators. Rome's working-class citizens loved them with the same energy modern crowds reserve for famous athletes. As bowls were filled and coins exchanged, someone inevitably brought up yesterday's fight in the amphitheatre. "Did you see that Gaul's footwork? Swift as Mercury," one man might say, waving his spoon mid-air. Another shook his head, dismissive. "Footwork means nothing if he can't hold a shield. I'm betting on the Thracian next time." Even those who couldn't afford a ticket to the arena felt they were part of the action through these heated debates. But gladiators were only the beginning. People gossiped about everything: emperors, senators, grain shortages, military campaigns, scandals, marriages, divorces, and hopelessly corrupt tax collectors. A rumour could take shape in under a minute. One man mentioned that the emperor seemed ill during a public appearance. By afternoon, half the neighbourhood was convinced Roman politics would collapse by nightfall. Another whispered that a wealthy noblewoman had secretly divorced her husband. Someone else swore they saw her slipping into a merchant's home after dark. Truth, exaggeration, and imagination merged seamlessly. The thermopolium owner occasionally tried to calm the uproar, but he rarely succeeded. His tavern was less a restaurant and more a stage where Rome performed itself. Market women chimed in with sharp insights. Dock workers described the latest shipments from Egypt. A young apprentice boasted about overhearing his master talk to a setter, though no one believed him. All of it flowed freely from group to group, turning strangers into conversational partners. In a city of 1,000,000 souls, where most people lived in cramped, noisy apartments, the thermopolium became a place where daily life felt shared. Worries softened when spoken aloud, opinions sharpened when challenged, and even the simplest bowl of lentils tasted richer when eaten in the middle of a heated debate about who would triumph in the next gladiator match. Here, standing between simmering jars and passing crowds, Romans found nourishment not only in food, but in the stories that tied their lives together. Before you even reached the counter of a thermopolium, your senses announced its presence. The smells drifted first: warm lentils softened in olive oil, chickpea mash spiced with cumin, roasted nuts glazed in honey, and, unmistakably, the sharp tang of garum wafting through the air like a beacon of Roman identity. These aromas mingled with the scent of whetstone, sweat, incense from nearby shrines, and the ever-present dust kicked up by passing carts. The entire street became a tapestry of fragrances, both pleasant and overwhelming, reflecting the raw truth of a crowded ancient city. Next came the sounds. Rome never slept, but during the midday rush, it roared. Shopkeepers shouted prices, children chased each other between stalls, and travelling merchants clanged bronze trinkets together to draw attention. In the distance, a blacksmith hammered iron into shape. Clang, hiss, clang, while a donkey brayed in protest as a handler tugged it through the crush of people. Patrons gathered around the thermopolium added their own layer of noise: clay bowls clinking against the counter, ladles scraping the bottoms of deep jars, and voices overlapping in a dozen simultaneous conversations. Then there was the chaos, the kind that would overwhelm someone unused to Roman life, but felt completely natural to those who grew up in its rhythm. People moved constantly: shoppers with baskets full of figs, soldiers on errands, fishermen carrying nets that dripped onto the pavement, young apprentices racing to deliver messages for their masters, and slaves hurrying with jars of water balanced precariously on their shoulders. Everyone seemed to be in motion except the thermopolium owner, who somehow remained steady amid the whirlwind, stirring stew, serving bowls, making change, and shouting orders to his helper without missing a beat. Street performers occasionally joined the fray, a flute player hoping for a coin, a juggler showing off for a crowd, or a storyteller reciting cheeky verses about the latest scandal. Their presence added colour to the street, giving customers something to watch while waiting for their meal. What made the Thermopolium environment so remarkable was the sense of shared space. No walls separated diners from the street, no doors muted the sounds. Eating here meant being part of Rome's daily heartbeat. Every scent, shout, and shuffle of feet became woven into the experience. Food was not simply consumed, it was lived, surrounded by the full, unfiltered energy of one of history's greatest cities. In this chaos, Romans found comfort. Noise meant life, and life meant belonging. Behind every steaming pot and every freshly filled bowl stood the men and women who transformed raw ingredients into the daily fuel of the Roman population. The workers of the Thermopolium were not wealthy restaurateurs or respected chefs. They were ordinary Romans, often from humble backgrounds, who carried the weight of the city's hunger on their shoulders. Their world was one of constant heat, constant motion, and constant noise. The owner, usually called the Caupo, was the centre of the operation. He woke before sunrise, when the city was still dim and quiet, to begin preparing the day's food. Before customers ever arrived, he had already lit the furnace, arranged the clay jars, ground herbs with a stone mortar, and stirred pots full of lentils that needed hours to soften. His movements were practiced and efficient, more like a craftsman than a simple cook. He knew exactly how much salt to add when the chickpeas reached the perfect texture, and how to keep the stew warm without burning it. Working beside him, though often less noticed, were apprentices or slaves, usually boys or young men, who handled the hardest tasks. They hauled water from public fountains, chopped vegetables, washed soot-blackened cooking pots, and ran back and forth to nearby markets for extra bread or olives when supplies ran low. Their tunics carried the permanent scent of smoke and stew, and their hands were constantly stained with oil. Yet without them, the Thermopolium could not function for even an hour. Women also played a role, especially in taverns run as family businesses. They might knead bread, season dishes, count coins, or serve customers during the busiest hours of the day. Some even prepared small desserts, like honeyed pastries, to sell alongside the savoury meals. Their voices were often sharp, practical, and experienced, cutting through the chaos with instructions or warnings shouted over the counter. A good Thermopolium depended on more than cooking skill. It required endurance. Workers faced burning heat from the stove, heavy clay vessels to lift, and the relentless flow of customers demanding quick service. Coins exchanged hands constantly. Tempers flared when portions seemed too small, and the owner needed the instincts of both a businessman and a diplomat to keep everyone satisfied. These workers rarely received praise. Most customers barely noticed their effort, focusing only on the food placed in their bowls. Yet they were the quiet backbone of Roman street life. Through their labour, thousands found nourishment every day. They fed soldiers, sailors, merchants, craftsmen, beggars, travellers, and in doing so they helped keep the largest city of the ancient world alive and moving. Their contribution was humble, but indispensable. No meal at a Thermopolium felt complete without something to wash it down, and in ancient Rome the drink of choice, no matter the hour, was wine. To modern taste buds, Roman wine might have seemed harsh, thick, or overly sweet, but to the people of the empire it was a daily necessity. Even the poorest Romans expected a cup of it with their lunch. Not the finest vintages, of course. Those were reserved for banquets and noble households, but a cheap, mass-produced variety that flowed as freely as the Tiber itself. The wine served at street taverns was almost always mixed with water, a practice Romans considered civilized and essential. Drinking wine straight from the barrel was associated with barbarians, wild Gauls, rude Thracians, or anyone who lacked Roman discipline. So even at the humblest Thermopolium, the owner kept a jug of water beside the wine jar, diluting the drink just enough to stretch the supply. It didn't always improve the flavour, but it kept the price low and the customers content. On hotter days, a customer might ask for wine mixed with a splash of vinegar. A sour drink called posca, popular with soldiers and labourers, its sharp bite cut through the heat and dust. and it was cheap enough that even a man with only a few coins to spare could afford it. Those who preferred sweetness could request mulsum, wine blended with honey, though this was a small luxury rarely offered in simple taverns. People drank standing up, clay cups held casually between conversations. A worker might take a sip between mouthfuls of stew, wipe his mouth on the back of his hand, and dive right back into a heated argument about the next gladiator match. Wine loosened tongues, softened tempers, and made the midday rush feel a little lighter. It also fueled more reckless conversations, sharp jokes about corrupt officials, bold fantasies about wealth, or whispered comments about attractive neighbours passing by. But wine wasn't the only essential drink. Water, gathered from Rome's famous aqueduct-fed fountains, played its part too. Boys from the Thermopolium fetched it in ceramic jugs, weaving through crowds as they carried precious supplies back to the tavern. Fresh water cooled the pots, thinned stews, and eased the constant heat of the kitchen. Yet Romans rarely drank it alone. Many believed plain water was unhealthy unless mixed with wine or boiled into broth. In this constant interplay between water and wine, Romans found the perfect companion to street food, refreshing, familiar, and as lively as the city itself. Whether rich, poor, sober, or slightly buzzing, every customer lifted their cup with the same simple pleasure. A small comfort in the middle of Rome's unending chaos. Eating at a Thermopolium was never just about food. It was about navigating the wild, unpredictable world of the Roman streets. For every comforting bowl of stew and every friendly debate about gladiators, there lurked an entire ecosystem of opportunists, performers, and troublemakers who thrived in the crowded chaos. A man might enter the tavern hungry and relaxed, but he always kept one hand on his coin pouch. Rome was magnificent, yes, but it was also full of people ready to seize a moment's distraction. Among the most skilled were the pickpockets, often young boys or wiry teenagers working in pairs. One would bump a customer, by accident, perhaps spilling a bit of wine on his tunic, while the other slipped nimble fingers into a purse. By the time the victim muttered a curse and wiped off the spill, the thief had already vanished into the crowd. Thermopolia were perfect hunting grounds, busy, loud, and filled with customers juggling bowls, cups, and conversations. A single moment of laughter or irritation was all a thief needed. Still, not everyone in the crowd was dangerous. Many came simply to entertain. Street performers hovered near the Thermopolium entrances, hoping the sense of warm food would draw spectators and coins. A juggler might toss clay cups into the air, balancing one on his forehead as children shrieked in delight. A flute player stood by a fountain, filling the air with a lilting melody that rose above the noise. Some storytellers recited heroic epics or whispered scandalous tales, adjusting their performance depending on who gathered to listen. Their presence added colour and charm, turning a simple lunch into a moment of shared amusement. But the streets held other risks too, risks that had nothing to do with criminals. A startled horse could suddenly bolt, sending carts crashing into market stalls. A delivery of amphorae might spill, fragments of pottery scattering across the stones, and in the most crowded districts, a small fire in a nearby apartment could send waves of smoke rolling down the street, forcing people to scatter in panic. In such moments, customers grabbed their bowls and moved as quickly as they could, cursing the city's cramped design, even as they accepted it as part of daily life. Despite all this, Romans kept returning to the Thermopolia. Danger didn't deter them. It was simply another thread in Rome's vast, living tapestry. To eat here was to embrace the city fully, its warmth, its flavour, its danger, and its unstoppable pulse. And for most Romans, that was reason enough to stay. By the time the sun dipped behind Rome's rooftops, the Thermopolium began to change character. The heat of the day softened into a warm glow, shadows lengthened across the cobblestones, and the rush of midday slowly unravelled into something looser, calmer, almost reflective. Yet the tavern did not truly quiet, not in a city that rarely slept. Instead, it shifted into a different rhythm, one that revealed just how essential these humble street taverns were to the identity of ancient Rome. For many Romans, the Thermopolium was not merely a place to eat. It was the closest thing they had to a neighbourhood hub, a public living room, and a shared refuge. Most of the city's population lived in cramped insulae, apartment blocks with thin walls, smoky hallways, and limited space for cooking. Homes were for sleeping, not eating. So when hunger struck, the solution lay on the street. In the warm jars of stew, the sharp tang of garum, the clatter of bowls against stone counters, and the easy company of strangers. In this sense, the Thermopolium became a great equalizer. Here, fishermen rubbed shoulders with clerks, slaves and freedmen whispered gossip beside weary craftsmen. Even the occasional soldier on leave would stop in, armour dusty, sword clattering softly at his side as he ordered a quick portion of pulse. Rank mattered everywhere in Rome, everywhere except here, where everyone stood in the same posture, bowl in hand, waiting for the ladle to scrape the bottom of the pot. Night brought new conversations. Older men lingered longer, debating politics or recalling battles from their youth. Young lovers stole glances over cups of watered wine. Workers finishing late shifts arrived hungry, grateful that the tavern's coals still glowed. Even travellers used the Thermopolium as a compass. If you wanted to know what a neighbourhood was like, all you had to do was listen to the chatter around its street tavern. And though few customers ever said it aloud, the Thermopolium also carried a quiet emotional weight. It offered comfort after a long day, familiarity in a city that changed constantly, and companionship in a world where most people fought hard simply to survive. A warm bowl of lentils couldn't erase hardship, but it could make a man feel grounded, human, alive. By closing time, the owner wiped down the counters, banked the embers, and stacked empty bowls. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Rome would awaken hungry, noisy, restless, and the Thermopolium would be ready, waiting to feed not just bodies, but the very spirit of the city. Before the first hint of dawn touched the tiled rooftops of Edo, the Ashigaru barracks were already stirring. Life for these foot soldiers was shaped by discipline, routine, and the quiet acceptance that, even in an age of peace, the role of a warrior never truly slept. Their day began not with leisure, but with the sharp wooden hyoshigi clapped together by a supervising officer, the sound echoing through the wooden corridors like a command from the dark itself. One strike was enough to wake even the deepest sleeper. Inside the long, sparsely furnished room, Ashigaru rose from simple straw mats laid neatly in rows. Their bedding had no softness, but the men barely noticed. They were used to the hardness of soldierly life. Each man folded his thin futon with practiced motions, smoothing the corners until they were exact. Nothing in the barracks was allowed to look sloppy. Not blankets, not clothing, not a single pair of sandals left at the wrong angle. Order reflected loyalty, and loyalty reflected honour. The faint smell of the previous night's fire still lingered. Someone quietly stoked the embers in the hearth, adding a small bundle of kindling until the flames revived, giving the room a dim amber glow. Ashigaru warmed their hands just long enough to chase away the morning chill before moving on to their chores. Silence dominated these early moments, broken only by the rustling of fabric, the clatter of wooden buckets, and the soft creak of floorboards as men prepared for another long day. A typical morning task was sweeping the courtyard, an exercise in mindfulness as much as cleanliness. Ashigaru moved in lines, pulling long-handled bamboo brooms over gravel paths, fallen leaves, and thin drifts of dust. Their movements were steady and rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Edo might have been a peaceful city, but the samurai ethos demanded constant readiness. To live in an orderly space was to keep the mind sharp. After sweeping came the inspection of equipment. Spears were checked for cracks, spearheads polished until they glinted even in low light armour pieces. Light, practical, rarely used in actual battle, were aired out and brushed free of dust. A man's attire reflected his worth, even if that attire spent most days hanging in storage. Only when everything was in order did the Ashigaru line up in the courtyard, breath misting in the cold morning air, awaiting instructions. The sun had still not risen fully, yet their work had already begun. Such was the rhythm of Ashigaru life, quiet, disciplined, and rooted in the belief that even in peaceful times, a warrior must rise before the world. For all the discipline woven into an Ashigaru's routine, nothing grounded their daily life more than the meals that sustained them. Food in the barracks was simple, humble, repetitive, and utterly essential. It lacked the refinement of samurai banquets or the richness found in merchant households. Yet for the Ashigaru, these meals were the quiet anchor of every day. The morning ration was predictable: steamed white rice, served in a wooden bowl still warm from the pot. Rice was more than food. It was the symbol of a domain's wealth, the backbone of the entire hierarchy. To receive a daily ration, even a small one, was a reminder that the Ashigaru served their lord directly. Every grain held meaning. Alongside the rice came miso soup, thin but comforting, made from fermented soybean paste dissolved in hot water, sometimes enriched with scraps of tofu or pieces of green onion when supplies allowed. Pickles, tsukemono, added a sharp, salty bite to each meal. Pickled daikon, cucumber, or plum. Their strong flavour cut through the plainness of rice and kept the palate awake. Occasionally, dried fish was served, chewy and briny, a reminder of Japan's reliance on the sea. On rare days, when the domain's budget permitted, or when the quartermaster was feeling charitable, they received a small piece of fresh fish or boiled vegetables. Such moments were quietly celebrated, though never openly. Modesty was part of a soldier's character. Meals were eaten quickly and without conversation. Sitting cross-legged, Ashigaru lowered their heads, not out of fear, but habit. Speaking during meals was discouraged. The food was meant to nourish the body, not distract the mind. Wooden bowls clacked gently against the floor, chopsticks tapped lightly against rims, and the steam rising from miso soup gave the barracks a warm, earthy scent. The midday meal often mirrored the morning one, though sometimes with porridge instead of rice, stretched thin to feed many mouths. Evenings, however, were the quietest and most reflective mealtime of the day. After hours of drilling or guard duty, Ashigaru gathered again for rice, soup, and pickles, the soft amber glow of lanterns casting their shadows against the wooden walls. They did not dine like noble warriors. Their meals lacked ceremony, luxury, or variety. Yet these simple rations kept them steady, fuel for the long, uneventful days that defined life in the Edo period. In a world where battles rarely came, nourishment became a kind of silent discipline, a daily reminder that strength was built as much from patience as from steel. After the morning meal, the courtyard of the barracks transformed into a training ground. Though Japan lived under the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Ashigaru were still expected to train as if war might return tomorrow. Their primary weapon was the yari, the spear, and mastering it required endless repetition. Not elegant swordplay, not poetic duels, but thrust, step, recover, again, again, again. The yari itself was deceptively simple, a long wooden shaft capped with a polished steel blade. Depending on the domain, a spear could be as short as 2 meters or nearly twice that length. Ashigaru carried these weapons not for ceremony, but practicality. Spears created distance, control, and formation, the backbone of battlefield strategy in centuries past. Even if wars no longer raged, the old traditions demanded readiness. Training began with stance work. Ashigaru planted their feet in gravel, knees bent, shoulders loose but firm. An officer paced behind them, correcting posture with the butt of his own spear. A tap on the leg meant lower. A tap on the shoulder meant relax. A louder tap, accompanied by a sigh, meant do it again. Then came thrust drills, 100 thrusts forward, 100 thrusts angled, 100 sweeping motions meant to break the charge of an imaginary rider. Each movement had to be sharp, controlled, and in time with the group, spears sliced the air in unison, their wooden shafts vibrating faintly with each strike. The sound of training, shoof, 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 echoed across the courtyard like a heartbeat. Sweat gathered quickly, even on cool mornings. Some men gritted their teeth, others controlled their breaths to conserve strength. A few younger recruits trained with too much enthusiasm, their thrusts exaggerated, earning amused glances from older soldiers who had long since learned that true discipline was quiet, steady, and unshowy. Beyond the drills, Ashigaru practiced formation movement. Rows shifted together, stepping forward and back with the precision of a single body. Officers called out commands, short, sharp syllables carried on the air. The men pivoted, lowered spears, raised them again, simulating the phalanx-like lines their ancestors once formed on chaotic Sengoku battlefields. By late morning, arms ached, thighs burned, and palms stung from gripping the wood shaft. Yet training rarely ended early. Even in peacetime, Ashigaru were judged by the sharpness of their discipline and the unity of their movements. A warrior without a war was still expected to behave like one. And so the spear drills continued, day after day. Habits forged not for glory, but for duty, tradition, and the quiet pride of belonging to a lineage of soldiers whose strength came from repetition. If spear training built the body, guard duty tested the spirit. In the Edo period, an age of peace tightly maintained by the Tokugawa shogunate, battles were scarce, but rules were abundant. Castles, gates, bridges, storehouses, and official residences all required constant supervision. And it was the Ashigaru, the lowest-ranking warriors, who performed this long, monotonous watch. It was both an honor and a burden. Assignments rotated daily. One morning, a man might be stationed at the castle gate, standing rigid beside towering wooden doors, greeting officials as they passed. Another day, he might patrol the outer moat, listening to the croak of frogs and the distant hum of townspeople, all while keeping an eye out for thieves, drunks, or suspicious wanderers. At night, he might guard the fire watch towers, scanning the dark horizon for the dreaded glow of flames. The greatest fear in a tightly packed wooden city like Edo guard duty demanded stillness. Hours passed with little more than the occasional nod to a passing merchant or a quiet exchange with another guard at the end of a shift. The Ashigaru stood with spear or staff in hand, armor tied neatly, face set in a neutral expression that conveyed alertness, but not aggression. Showing boredom was frowned upon. Showing fatigue was worse. The warrior ethos insisted on a calm, steady presence. Yet inside, their thoughts drifted. Some silently recited poetry. Others planned what they would do on their next rest day. A few daydreamed about earning a small promotion or distinction, though such achievements were rare for men of their rank. Many simply endured, knowing that their watch was part of the invisible machinery that kept Edo safe and orderly. Occasionally, something broke the monotony. A noble procession swept past in a blur of lacquered palanquins and colourful banners. A group of rowdy labourers needed calming. A lost child approached, crying, and the Ashigaru guided him back to his mother. Once in a great while, a fire bell rang. And then every second mattered. Every man springing into motion to direct citizens, form barriers, and coordinate buckets of water. Most days, however, guard duty was quiet. The city did not erupt in rebellion, samurai did not charge through the gates, and thieves rarely attempted bold crimes near watchposts. Ashigaru performed their role faithfully, even when it felt thankless. In peace, their greatest strength was patience, for they were warriors who guarded not battlefields, but the fragile calm of the world around them. Between training drills and long hours of guard duty, Ashigaru lived in a world defined not by heroic battles, but by small practical tasks that filled the quiet stretches of their days. Peace in the Edo period meant that most foot soldiers spent far more time sweeping, repairing, and maintaining than fighting. And life between wars became a slow rhythm of survival, routine, and small comforts. Many Ashigaru turned to fishing during their free time. Armed with little more than a bamboo rod and a simple line, they walked to nearby rivers or castle moats, hoping to catch carp or small river fish they could grill over a modest fire. Fishing wasn't just about food, it was a rare moment of solitude. Sitting by the water, listening to the soft ripple of currents, gave them space to breathe in a life otherwise filled with commands and duties. Some never caught anything, but even returning empty-handed felt better than staying cooped up in the barracks. Others filled the hours with maintenance chores. Spears dull easily, and armour grows stiff if neglected, so a shigaru often sat outside in the shade, carefully oiling spear shafts, tightening armour cords, or patching worn tabi socks. The work was repetitive but grounding. It reminded them that even if no enemy marched against their domain, a warrior cared for his tools as faithfully as a monk tended his temple. Some men cultivated small vegetable patches near the barracks, tiny squares of earth where they grew green onions, radishes, or herbs to flavour their otherwise plain meals. These gardens required little space and even less skill, but they brought quiet pride. A handful of fresh greens shared among friends could transform an ordinary pot of rice into a small feast. During hotter months, a shigaru gathered under trees to mend straw sandals, carve wooden charms, or simply talk. They spoke not of grand strategy, but of practical worries. The price of rice, the temperament of their superiors, or the small hopes they carried for their families. A few men even practiced writing, their brushes tracing careful strokes on scrap paper as they tried to improve their characters. In the absence of war, life became a long lesson in patience. These simple activities, humble, quiet, often overlooked, kept the Ashigaru anchored. Their days were not filled with the thunder of battle or the glory of heroic charges, but with the steady, unremarkable tasks that allowed them to endure. In many ways, this slow rhythm shaped them more deeply than any battlefield ever could. For all their rough duties and humble status, many Ashigaru nurtured a surprisingly quiet inner world. The long peace of the Edo period left them with stretches of time between duties, hours that could have easily dissolved into boredom or restlessness. Instead, many turned inward, embracing the arts that had long been respected throughout Japan. Among these, haiku writing and simple calligraphy became gentle companions in an otherwise rigid life. Haiku appealed to the Ashigaru for its simplicity and clarity. It asked for no lavish ink, no expensive paper, no complex schooling, only observation, honesty, and a brief moment of stillness. After a day of polishing spears or standing guard at a castle gate, an Ashigaru might sit beneath a barrack's eave, listening to the wind rustle through bamboo. In that quiet space, he could condense a feeling, a season, or a fleeting moment into 17 syllables. A single frog leaping into water. The creak of an old gate at dusk. Lantern light trembling on a rainy night. These were not the grand themes of noble poets, but the small truths of daily soldierly life. Writing haiku wasn't about impressing others. It was about grounding oneself, capturing one breath of clarity in a world ruled by order and obligation. Calligraphy, though more demanding, offered similar solace. Ashigaru often practiced with cheap brushes and ink diluted to stretch supplies. They copied simple characters again and again, tracing their strokes with slow precision. The goal wasn't perfection but improvement, a quiet discipline mirroring their martial training. Each brushstroke required balance, control of breath, and a steady hand. In some ways, it was another form of combat training, a battle against impatience, distraction, and self-doubt. A few Ashigaru kept personal diaries, recording thoughts, weather patterns, or small events from the day. Others exchanged poems with fellow soldiers, a practice that built quiet bonds in a communal life where privacy was scarce. Even those who weren't literate sometimes asked friends to write poems for them, preserving shared moments in ink. These artistic practices softened the mental burden of barracks life. They allowed the Ashigaru to remain warriors without hardening into stone. For men whose days were spent polishing weapons they rarely used, art became a gentle reminder that life held beauty beyond duty, that a soldier could still be a human being with thoughts, emotions, and a quiet longing for meaning. In a peaceful era where swords stayed sheathed, it was often the ink brush, not the spear, that shaped an Ashigaru's heart. Though Ashigaru lived with discipline shaped by their lords, their deeper sense of balance came from something quieter: faith. The Edo period was an age in which everyday life blended seamlessly with spiritual practice. Even for low-ranking warriors, men who rarely saw battle and often faced uncertainty about the future, shrines offered a steady place of grounding. Prayer, ritual, and simple gestures of devotion shaped the emotional rhythm of their lives, just as much as training or guard duty. Near every castle town stood small Shinto shrines, usually tucked beneath tall cedars or beside quiet footpaths. Ashigaru often visited these shrines during rest hours, approaching the wooden torii gate with bowed heads and slow steps. They washed their hands at the purification basin, the cold water flowing over calloused palms worn from spear practice. It was a small act, but one that symbolized clearing the mind. Inside the shrine grounds, the world seemed to exhale. Crickets sang, leaves rustled overhead. Wind chimes softly chimed against each other. Here the relentless structure of barracks life loosened its grip. Ashigaru clapped twice, bowed deeply, and whispered their hopes. Modest hopes, rarely grand. Some prayed for health or favourable weather. Others prayed for their families in distant villages. A few asked simply for strength to endure another year of duty. In the evenings, lantern-lit paths glowed softly as Ashigaru walked to local Buddhist temples as well. Buddhism offered them a sense of introspection, a reminder that suffering and hardship were part of life's natural cycle. Listening to a monk's chant drifting from within the temple hall, they felt the weight of their daily routines ease, even if only briefly. Seasonal festivals were especially meaningful. During the new year, Ashigaru gathered with townspeople to offer the first prayers of the year, ring bells, and warmed themselves with sweet rice wine. In summer, they visited shrines during Obon, lighting small lanterns to honor ancestors. Although they were soldiers, they participated just as any commoner did, humble visitors seeking connection with something larger than themselves. Spiritual practice was not grand or dramatic for them. It was gentle, woven into the margins of their days, a bowed head before duty, a small talisman tied to a spear shaft, a whispered haiku that doubled as a prayer. These moments reminded the Ashigaru that they were not merely workers in armor, but individuals with inner lives shaped by tradition and belief. In an era of peace where battles faded into memory, it was often the shrine, not the battlefield, that shaped the warrior's soul. Life as an Ashigaru was not glamorous, heroic, or adorned with the sweeping legends sung about higher-ranking samurai. Yet within the barracks, those long wooden rooms filled with straw mats, clattering bowls, and shared routines, a different kind of strength emerged. Camaraderie. A brotherhood forged not by battle, but by boredom, duty, and the quiet hardships of everyday life. The men lived shoulder to shoulder. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Everyone heard when someone sneezed, sighed, muttered in sleep, or shifted restlessly during the night. Instead of driving them apart, these close quarters wove the soldiers into a strange, informal family. Arguments happened, of course, usually about chores or who borrowed whose tool without asking, but they rarely lasted. Life in the barracks was too interconnected for grudges. During slow afternoons, Ashigaru shared small stories from home. One man spoke of rice fields in his village, another of siblings he rarely saw, another of a wife he hoped to marry once his wages improved. These were not dramatic tales of valor. They were simple glimpses of quiet lives waiting beyond the barracks walls. Listening to each other became a kind of comfort. Older Ashigaru often acted like unofficial mentors, offering practical advice. How to knot armor cords so they wouldn't loosen, how to stretch rice rations when pay was delayed, how to fold bedding fast enough to avoid reprimand. Their guidance carried the tone of men who had long surrendered the dream of rising in rank, but wished to spare younger recruits unnecessary trouble. Evenings, after the final duties were done, carried a unique warmth. Lanterns glowed softly, casting long yellow shadows across the wooden floors. Some men gathered around with small flasks of cheap sake, sipping cautiously, knowing drunkenness was strictly forbidden. Others played simple board games like shogi, their strategy pieces sliding softly across worn wooden grids. Laughter rose in low, hushed bursts, never loud enough to disturb officers, but enough to loosen the stiffness that training had hammered into their bones. On colder nights, when the barracks shuttered its doors against the wind, Ashigaru huddled around the hearth. They shared roasted chestnuts, traded gossip about their superiors, or debated which local festival had the best food stalls. For a moment, hierarchy melted. They were no longer ranks beneath ranks, but men keeping the night at bay together. This camaraderie didn't make life easier, but it made it livable. In a world where war rarely called and advancement was slow, companionship became the Ashigaru's greatest source of resilience. Their battles were few, but their brotherhood was constant. By the time lanterns dimmed and the barracks settled into silence, a strange truth always lingered in the minds of many Ashigaru. They were warriors without wars. The Edo period was an era shaped by peace so enduring that entire generations of soldiers never saw battle. Their spears stayed polished but unused, their armor maintained yet untouched by combat. And though this peace spared countless lives, it also created a quiet tension within the men who had been raised to fight, but were instead asked simply to endure. Some Ashigaru accepted this with gratitude. Peace meant stability, steady meals, steady pay, and the comfort of routine. They could grow old without fear of dying on muddy fields beneath enemy arrows. They could finish their duties and walk to shrines, fish rivers, write poems, and build small futures that chaos would have stolen from them in earlier eras. For these men, the lack of war was a blessing, but others felt the weight of it like a stone hidden under their armor. Stories of past battles, tales of valor from fathers and grandfathers who fought in the Sengoku period, echoed louder in their imaginations than the quiet rhythms of daily life. Some young recruits trained with feverish intensity, hoping secretly that a moment of danger might finally come. Yet nothing came. The shogunate's peace held firm, and the Ashigaru's spears remained pointed at nothing but practiced dummies in the empty air. The contradiction defined their lives, trained to protect, yet rarely given the chance to prove their worth. Their days passed in long stretches of discipline, humility, and patience, virtues the age demanded. And perhaps it was precisely this quiet perseverance that allowed Edo society to flourish. Warriors who did not fight became guardians of order, stability, and public life. Their presence at gates, temples, warehouses, and bridges reminded the people that peace was not accidental. It was maintained by countless watchful eyes. When the nights grew cold and the barracks creaked softly under the wind, Ashigaru sometimes sat awake, staring at the faint glow of dying embers. They wondered what legacy they would leave behind. No battlefield tales, no heroic banners, no songs sung in their honor, and yet, in the calm of their long duties, in the loyalty they upheld, in the quiet strength they carried through years of uneventful service, they shaped an era more profoundly than they realized. Their lack of battle did not diminish them. Instead, it made them the silent pillars of a peaceful age. Warriors without wars, but essential all the same. Walk down a narrow Roman side street, one of those cramped alleys where the buildings lean inward like gossiping neighbours, and you will eventually find it, a Popina, the beating heart of working-class Rome. You hear it before you see it. Laughter spills out the door, mixed with shouting, clattering bowls, and the muffled thump of feet shifting on worn floorboards. Push aside the wooden curtain or slip through the uneven doorway, and you step into a world completely unlike the marble-clad villas and polished forums that define Rome imagination. This is where the real city eats. The first thing that hits you is the smell. A thick, smoky haze hangs in the air from oil lamps and small clay stoves. The aroma of cheap wine, sour and sharp, mixes with bubbling lentil stew and the unmistakable tang of hot garum, Rome's favourite fermented fish sauce. It sizzles in pans, clings to the air, and seeps into clothes so deeply that regular customers carry its scent long after leaving. Some joke that you could follow a man's social class simply by his garum cloud. Next comes the crowded chaos. A popina is small, barely enough space for a counter, a stove, a few shelves of pottery, and a handful of benches shoved into corners. Yet somehow 20 people manage to fit themselves inside, elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder. The room hums with life. Dock workers gulping stew, beggars warming their hands over oil lamps, gamblers rolling dice in the back, and labourers arguing about chariot races as though their honour depends on it. Along the far wall sits the iconic dolium counter, a stone or brick worktop with circular openings that hold sunken clay jars. From these, hot stew, olives, chickpeas, meat scraps, and mulled wine are ladled out with startling speed. The innkeeper, often loud and broad-shouldered, moves like a conductor in a symphony of hunger, scooping, pouring, and shouting prices over the din. Behind him, a smoky brazier keeps the food warm, its coals glowing like the centre of a small furnace. Space is so tight that customers rarely sit properly. Most lean, crouch, or perch on whatever surface is free. They clutch clay bowls in one hand, bread in the other, eating quickly before someone bumps their elbow and steals a bite. It is messy, loud, and utterly alive. This is the Roman popina, not grand, not elegant, but essential. A refuge of heat, food, and human noise, Rome's unsung theatre of survival. Step closer to the counter, and the heart of the popina reveals itself. A cluster of clay pots, each sunken into the stone counter like miniature cauldrons. Their contents simmer all day, filling the tiny room with rich, salty perfume. The innkeeper lifts each lid with a practiced flick, letting bursts of steam escape, steam carrying the flavours that defined the working-class Roman diet. The most common pot holds pulse, a thick porridge made of wheat or barley. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, pulse was the backbone of poor diets. It absorbed whatever ingredients the innkeeper could afford that week. Carrots, onions, wilted greens, occasionally a sliver of pork. Next to it bubbled lentil stew, dark and hearty, seasoned with garlic and lovage. The lentils softened into a creamy blend that coated the tongue with warmth, perfect for labourers whose work didn't wait for full stomachs. Then there was the aroma that ruled the room. Garum. Not just any garum, but hot garum, gently warmed until its pungent, fermented bite expanded into every corner of the tavern. The popina used it on everything. A ladle over stew, a drizzle over bread, a splash in wine, even mixed into sauces for olives or pickled vegetables. It was Rome's universal seasoning, as essential as salt is today, yet far more assertive. Bread formed the popina's unofficial utensils. Customers tore off dense chunks, dipping them into stews or mopping up stray streaks of sauce. The loaves were round, stamped with a bakery mark, and often slightly burnt at the edges, evidence of hurried baking in Rome's massive communal ovens. Other pots held chickpeas simmered with herbs, pickled fish, and vegetables stewed in cheap olive oil. Some taverns served a small amount of meat, but it was rarely generous, scraps, trimmings, or cuts too tough for the wealthy. Still, when mixed with garum and eaten piping hot, even the simplest meat could feel like a feast. And then there was wine, never served pure but diluted heavily with water to stretch the supply, its sharp edge softened when warmed slightly or mixed with spices. Customers drank it from small clay cups, the rims chipped from years of being knocked together in toasts, arguments, or drunken clumsiness. Everything in the popina had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Every flavour, strong, salty, smoky, was designed to sustain bodies pushed to their limits in Rome's demanding workforce. These were not the foods of luxury, but of life. food that filled, comforted, and pushed men through another day in the great city that never slowed down. Inside a Roman Papina, silence did not exist. The moment you stepped in, the small room swallowed you in a storm of noise, heat, and movement. Oil lamps flickered restlessly, casting jittering shadows across the walls. Smoke curled upward from the brazier, hugging the ceiling beams until the air itself felt thick enough to drink. The warmth hit you like a wave, relentless, familiar, oddly comforting. This was not a place for nobles seeking refinement. This was the furnace where the working class came to thaw their bones and escape the cold reality of Rome's hard labour. Every sound competed for dominance. A group of men shouted over a game of Alea, dice clattering against the wooden table. A barge worker laughed so loudly his voice cut through the room like a knife. The innkeeper barked orders to his assistant. "More oil! More wine! Watch the pot!" while a customer complained that his stew was too watery. In the corner, someone cursed his luck at the dice. In another, a pair of friends argued heatedly about which gladiator would triumph in the next games. Outside, the street noise seeped in, the rumble of carts, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional call of a vendor selling figs or grilled fish. But inside the tavern, everything was amplified by the cramped space. Even the scrape of a clay bowl across the counter sounded like a declaration of hunger. And then there were the smells, layers upon layers of them. Burning oil, sour wine, warm bread, fish sauce, sweat, damp tunics, cheap perfume, and the occasional whiff of wet wool from customers escaping a sudden rainstorm. They fused into a scent that was unmistakable, unforgettable, and impossible to wash away from one's clothes. Regulars joked that you could always tell a Papina goer by how many dogs followed him home, lured by the lingering aroma of garum. People moved constantly. Someone squeezed past carrying a bowl. Another leaned awkwardly against the counter because there were no free seats. A pickpocket pretended to fix his sandal while eyeing someone's purse. A vendor stepped inside briefly to sell roasted nuts before being shooed out by the tavern keeper. The entire room churned like a human tide, cramped, smoky, loud. But beneath the chaos lay a deeper truth. This was one of the few places where Rome's poor felt life stirring around them. The Papina didn't judge their worn tunics or empty pockets. Here, a man was not rich or poor, only hungry or satisfied, cold or warm, alone or among his own. It was chaos, yes, but it was their chaos, their refuge, their Rome. If food gave the Papina its aroma, wine gave it its pulse. Every class in Rome drank wine, but in the taverns it flowed differently, cheaper, harsher, and mixed with enough water to stretch a single jug into many. Purity was a luxury reserved for the upper classes. In the Papina, wine was a tool, something to loosen tongues, to soften sore muscles, and to briefly blur the harshness of Roman life. Behind the counter, the innkeeper kept large clay amphorae leaning against the wall, sealed with wax and smelling faintly of vinegar and herbs. The wine they contained was often mass-produced, transported from distant provinces, oxidized by long travel, and cut with water that had been scooped from the nearest public fountain. Yet regulars lined up for it eagerly. They didn't drink for flavour. They drank for warmth, camaraderie, and the few minutes of relief each cup provided. The ritual was simple but essential. The innkeeper scooped wine using a small ladle, poured it into clay cups, then splashed in water from a wooden bucket. Sometimes he flavoured it with honey or herbs to mask the sourness. Sometimes the wine was reheated to give it a soothing edge, and sometimes it was served cold and sharp, tasting like the amphora itself. But nobody complained, not seriously. Complaints were part of the performance. A typical evening scene: a group of labourers with blistered hands leaning over a shared table, cups raised in a clumsy toast. To another day survived. Nearby, a pair of gamblers argued over dice, sloshing their wine with every gesture. A fisherman, still smelling of the Tiber, gulped his drink in 2 swallows, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and asked for another. A woman who'd been selling vegetables in the market sipped her diluted wine slowly, savouring the rare moment when her body wasn't moving from stall to stall. And mixed among them were the troublemakers, the men who drank too fast, whose voices rose too high, whose tempers began to spark. The innkeeper kept a sharp eye on these customers. One overturned cup could ignite a brawl, and one brawl could ruin a night's business. So he barked warnings, pushed elbows apart, and occasionally threw a drunk into the street before chaos could spread. For Rome's poor, wine was not a luxury. It was part of their survival strategy. It washed down stew, warmed cold bones, and softened the exhausting weight of the day. In the Popina, each cup was less about pleasure and more about endurance. Here, drinking was not escape. It was ritual. A shared moment of lightness before the world's burdens returned. When the sun dipped behind Rome's insulae and the streets turned dusky and narrow, the Popina transformed. By day it was a refuge for labourers seeking a quick meal. By night it became something deeper, louder, and far more unpredictable. Oil lamps flickered to life one by one, casting wavering golden halos across the cramped room. Shadows lengthened, corners darkened, and the atmosphere thickened like steam rising from a boiling pot. Night brought in a new kind of crowd. Men just off their shifts at the docks limped inside with aching backs and heavy footsteps. Washerwomen, their arms raw from scrubbing laundry, stopped by for a cup of wine before heading home. A few prostitutes leaned against the counter, chatting with potential clients, using the warm light to soften the hard lines of the day. Dice players reappeared like moths drawn to the glow, slapping their palms with excitement as they rolled bones across tables that wobbled on uneven legs. The sounds grew denser too. Laughter sharpened. Arguments grew bolder. The scrape of chairs, the pounding of fists on wood, the clatter of falling bowls. Every noise seemed magnified in the tight quarters. Even the innkeeper's voice shifted from daytime barks to nighttime roars. "No credit," he shouted. "Pay now or get out." Yet he also slipped regulars an extra ladle of stew, knowing full well they'd return again tomorrow. Food tasted different at night. The stews thickened as they simmered for hours, absorbing the flavours of vegetables, bones, spices, and the ever-present garum bread, once fresh, turned tougher but perfect for soaking up leftover broth. Occasionally a pot of spiced beans or grilled fish was added to the menu, reserved for customers who arrived late but hungry. The smoky air made everything richer, even if it soothed no one's lungs. Outside, Rome's nighttime sounds seeped inward. Drunken singing, arguments in distant alleys, stray dogs barking, the clank of a night watchman's staff against the pavement. But inside the Popina, the warmth wrapped itself around every tired body, creating a kind of fragile sanctuary. For a few hours the people inside forgot the cold rooms awaiting them, the debts they owed, the work waiting at dawn. By the time the innkeeper finally closed the door, sweeping customers out with gruff farewells, the Popina felt like a fire that had burned bright and then dimmed. The coals glowed faintly, bowls lay stacked, and the lingering smell of garum clung to the walls. Night in the Popina wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. A place where the city dropped its armour and breathed, loudly, roughly, but together. A Roman Popina was never just a place. It was a crossroads of lives. Step inside at any hour, and you encountered a shifting cast of characters, each with their own burdens, ambitions, and stories. The tavern didn't care who you were before entering. Once inside, everyone belonged to the same smoky, noisy, chaotic world. At the centre of this world stood the Poper, the tavern keeper. Usually broad-shouldered, loud, and immune to the heat of the brazier, he moved with the confidence of a man who knew every regular by name. And by debt. He settled arguments with one look, tossed out troublemakers without ceremony, and could ladle stew, pour wine, and negotiate prices all in a single breath. His wife, if he had one, usually managed the money box or scolded customers who tried to flirt. Beside them were the labourers, dock workers, carpenters, porters, bricklayers, and builders whose bodies bore the marks of endless toil. Their tunics were stained from sweat and dust, their hands rough and cut. They came for warmth, for calories, and for a moment when the city stopped demanding something from them, they leaned heavily against counters, exhaled loudly, and ate with the intensity of men refueling for survival. Then came the gamblers, always huddled in corners, rolling dice carved from bone or knuckle bones. Their eyes darted constantly, half at the game, half at potential marks. A lucky streak could buy a night of stew and wine. A bad roll could turn into a fist fight. Dice clicked across tabletops like sparks waiting to ignite trouble. The Peppina also attracted prostitutes, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace, sharing jokes with customers and offering company for a few coins. Their laughter brightened the room, even when their eyes showed exhaustion. They were part of the tavern's rhythm, never still, always navigating bodies and conversations. Begging for scraps were street children, barefoot and quick. They slipped in unnoticed, grabbed crusts of bread left on tables, and fled before the innkeeper shouted, "Rome's poor were everywhere," and the Peppina was one of the few places where leftovers appeared with regularity. Sometimes a soldier off duty would wander in, his armour dusty, his cloak smelling of campfire. He sat straight-backed, watching the crowd with habitually alert eyes, yet softened by wine and familiarity. Even he, armed and disciplined, blended into the tavern's swirling human mass. Everyone inside carried a different story, but in the Peppina, cramped, smoky, alive, they became the same. Hungry souls looking for warmth, company, and a moment's escape from Rome's relentless pace. The tavern was their refuge, their stage, their gathering place. A small world inside the vast empire. For all its warmth and noise, a Roman Peppina carried an undercurrent of danger that pulsed beneath the laughter and clattering bowls. The tavern was a haven for the poor, yes, but also for the desperate, the cunning, and the reckless. Anyone who stepped inside accepted an unspoken truth. The Peppina fed you, warmed you, sheltered you, but it could rob you just as quickly. The most common threat came from pickpockets, boys no older than 12 or 13 who slipped between patrons like smoke. They pretended to fetch water, adjust sandals, or beg for scraps. In reality, their sharp fingers hunted for loose coin pouches or untied belts. A distracted gambler or a drunk labourer made the perfect target. Some men learned to keep one hand on their cup and the other on their money. Then there were the con artists, grown men who used dice, charm, and a well-practiced story to separate a fool from his pay. They bragged loudly, bought a round of wine to gain trust, and then invited strangers to friendly games of alea. The stakes rose too quickly, the dice rolled too smoothly, and by the end of the night, someone stormed out cursing their own naivety. The brawlers were another problem, men whose tempers flared as quickly as the wine flowed. A spilled drink, a lost game, a crude joke, or a sharp insult could ignite a whirlwind of fists and overturned bowls. The innkeeper usually had to intervene, wielding a wooden ladle like a weapon, shouting louder than the fighters themselves. Sometimes he ended the fight with a shove out the door. Other times, he simply let the troublemakers punch themselves tired, knowing they'd sober up soon enough. But the most feared presence in the tavern was the thief who worked for gangs, a man who entered quietly, watched silently, and chose victims carefully. He rarely stole inside the Peppina. Instead, he followed men outside, trailing them down dark alleys where the only witnesses were stray dogs. A single shove, a quick grab, and he vanished into the narrow labyrinth of Rome's back streets. Even the tavern keeper lived with risk. Selling wine without proper dilution, serving spoiled stew, or angering the wrong customer could bring authorities, or worse, a local gang, crashing down on his livelihood. He walked a tightrope every night, trying to keep peace in a room built for chaos. Yet, despite all the dangers, people returned. Because danger was everywhere in Rome, on the streets, in the markets, on the docks, at least in the Popina, you faced it with a bowl in your hands, warmth on your skin, and a crowd around you. Risk was simply part of the tavern's rhythm, and the poor understood rhythm better than anyone. If Rome's forums were the stage of senators, poets, and generals, then the Popina was the theatre of the poor, a place where everyday Romans told their stories, vented their frustrations, and spun gossip into the lifeblood of the night. No matter how cramped the room or how thin the stew, the tavern served something far more intoxicating than diluted wine: conversation. Gossip flowed faster than the innkeeper could ladle stew. A dock worker, fresh from unloading ships at Ostia, leaned over his bowl to announce that grain shipments were delayed. "Prices will rise. Mark my words." Another man swore he saw a senator's wife sneaking into a bathhouse with someone who was not her husband. Two gamblers in the corner whispered about a new gladiator from Thrace, claiming he could slice a man open before he even raised his shield. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. In the Popina, stories became currency. People talked with their whole bodies. A fisherman slapped the counter to emphasize a point. A seamstress rolled her eyes so dramatically the whole room laughed. A man who had never left the city claimed he once saw a sea serpent off the coast, stretching his arms so wide that a nearby customer nearly lost his wine. Even lies became entertainment. And then there were the storytellers, those natural performers who turned every misfortune into a comedic tale. One described being chased by a goose in the forum with such tragic flair that the entire Popina erupted in laughter. Another reenacted his failed attempt to flirt with a merchant's daughter, complete with exaggerated gestures that left even the innkeeper chuckling. For many, this nightly exchange of words was a lifeline. Life in Rome's insulae was harsh. Cramped rooms, collapsing staircases, fires, thieves, endless work. But in the Popina, even the poorest Roman could feel heard. He could share his joys and failures, complain about taxes, mock pretentious elites, or brag about things he'd never actually done. The tavern gave him an audience. Women contributed to the chatter too. Washerwomen joked about the mountains of dirty tunics they scrubbed, vendors shared news from the markets. Prostitutes teased customers with quick wit and sharper humour than most men could handle. In this smoky little room, storytelling was survival. The Popina transformed everyday struggle into a communal performance, messy, loud, and beautifully human. Rome outside was enormous and indifferent, but inside the tavern, everyone had a voice. Everyone mattered. By the time the last customers drained their cups and the innkeeper snuffed out the oil lamps one by one, the Popina held a softened, almost tender silence. Smoke still floated lazily beneath the rafters. The counter, wiped roughly with a damp cloth, glistened faintly in the dying light. Empty bowls were stacked haphazardly, breadcrumbs littered the floor, and the faint scent of garum, always garum, clung stubbornly to every surface. But beneath the noise and grime, something deeper lingered. The sense that this small room was more than a tavern. It was a lifeline. For the poor of Rome, the Popina was warmth when their insulaes were freezing, light when their apartments were dark, and company when the city felt too vast and uncaring. Home was often a single rented room, shared with too many bodies and riddled with damp, rats, or collapsing walls. But inside the tavern, there was fire, stew, voices, and motion. Even the chaos here felt safer than the silence of a cold, empty room. It was in places like these, not the Senate, not the villas, not the palaces, where the real Rome breathed. Popinae and Tabernae were the daily pulse of the working class, the forgotten majority who built the aqueducts, repaired the streets, loaded the ships, baked the bread, and carried the empire on tired backs. And though these taverns were rowdy, smoky, and packed elbow to elbow, they offered what no law or emperor ever could. A sense of belonging friendships formed here. Rivalries, too. A man could walk in with nothing in his purse and still walk out having laughed, argued, eaten, and remembered for a moment that he was alive. The Popina offered community to those who spent their days unseen. In a place where class differences ruled everything, the tavern was one of the few spaces where lines blurred. A fisherman could sit beside a porter, a seamstress beside a gambler, a runaway slave beside a storyteller, and no one cared, as long as they didn't start a fight. Even the innkeeper, for all his shouting and stern warnings, played the role of guardian. He knew who needed extra stew, who needed credit, who needed to be thrown out before their temper sparked a brawl. He presided over his domain like a king of clay pots and wine buckets. When he finally locked the door and the last ember dimmed, the street outside felt colder, quieter, stripped of its heartbeat, but the papaya